our influence comes through our relationships, and our relationships are developed based on the competencies that we can bring into the workplace. But they're all unique. Your 3 to 5 leadership competencies that you do the best at are going to be very different than mine, and each leader needs to pursue it in their own way. When it really makes the most difference, the 3 to 5 things that are your biggest strengths are also the most needed in the role that you have.
Welcome to the Unconventional Leadership Podcast, where we help you unlock your potential as a leader. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Unconventional Leadership Podcast. We have the distinct pleasure today to be in the studio with Don Frericks. You all, as our loyal listeners, are very familiar with Don because, Don, you led an extraordinary leadership series on this podcast. And I think, Don, you and I have been together at least 3 times having dialogues over the last 200 plus episodes. So
I think you're right, yeah.
So I'm excited to have you back in the studio. And thank you for all that you've done and all you're going to bring to this conversation.
Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. So for those of you who have followed our journey over the last, let's say 20 years plus with me, maybe 30 years.
Could be.
But over the last 7 specifically with TMI, Don has been a mentor, a guide, a Sherpa, as we've been building out this brand to come alongside of you and help the humans that we support to unlock their greatest potential that God's placed inside of you. So, Don, I just thank you for all of your leadership.
Oh, no, it's been a pleasure. I think often, Mike, when we are yoked equally and we're traveling down the path together and we're trying to make a difference in the world, it just feels good to do good work, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Yeah.
It sure does. And we've been doing some great work with amazing organizations and brands over the last several years. One of the things that I have found most interesting is, one, that there are organizations who are deeply invested in bringing out the best in the talent they have on their team. And how many organizations, probably all, are dealing with some level of significant change management to identify and figure out their future forward. So I'd love to chat about that a little bit, about what we're learning, what you're seeing. You're in the science of human behavior and helping people identify their challenges, their weaknesses, their greatest strengths. And let's talk about that. How are we leveraging 360s? What are you focusing on in terms of coaching engagements today, where you spend a lot of your time coaching and designing strategy?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's an important one for us to figure out because in the world of leadership, there isn't a lot of hard data that allows us to make decisions and decide what to do to develop ourselves and our teams. And so it becomes a game of theory. It becomes a game of assessment. And sometimes that's just not good enough. We wouldn't run our businesses based on theory and assessment, right? We need data to look at what's happening. So as you alluded, the 360 to me has just been a breakthrough. The Zenger-Folkman partnership that we have is amazing because they truly have the best 360 for leaders around the world. And with a database with over 125,000 global leaders, it allows us to have a perspective that wherever you're at here in the United States, if you're right here in Cincinnati, you can get a perspective of how good is your leadership compared to this global database. And it makes a tangible difference because then you're not just measuring yourself against your own perceptions or your others, the people that you know the most in your business, but you're looking at it through the eyes of what statisticians might say. And so when we do that on the front end and the back end of an engagement, we begin to see a great trend line. And the improvement that I've seen runs from anywhere from 30 to 300% improvement in overall leadership effectiveness. And that's why we do what we do. We don't just do leadership development to make people smarter about leadership. We do it because we want them to be more effective as leaders. And then if they're working together as a team, when that leadership team comes together, it can be an amazing thing because now they're having synergy in a way that they've never had before.
Yeah. Are you finding that when you start introducing the topic of 360s, what are most individuals' visceral reaction? Meaning, how have they experienced 360s in the past compared to how we lead them through TMI and your own practice?
Yeah, I don't think everyone has had the quality of a 360 that we've had. So for those that have had the experience of a 360 that hasn't been as good of what we're using, today, they're like, oh, I've done that before. I don't know if I really need to do it again. And sometimes it's like, I've done it recently, and so I don't want to ask people for feedback too much. I don't want to tax them overly. But then some people are really excited, to be quite honest. They're like, I'd love more feedback. I think we're all starving for meaningful feedback in a way that we can do something about it, right? And then we often question, like, how do people perceive me as a leader? What's my boss really think of me? And so a well-done 360 allows us to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the phrases that we've used often is individuals want feedback so they can learn, grow, and develop. That doesn't mean they want to be told all of the positives. That means they want to learn, they want to hear how to learn, grow, and develop as an individual,
right,
as a team member, as a contributor to the overall organization and mission. And oh, by the way, some of that learning, growth, and development means that I'm going to hear some things that are not just professional, but maybe personal as well. The other component that we have found is that using a tool that is doing non-scientific research around 360s, going out to ChatGPT or Google and saying, what questions should I throw in a SurveyMonkey for Leadership 360, and deploying that comes with not the level of professionalism and experience we're trying to create for the clients we're serving. Right. So can you share a little bit about what an individual receives in more detail from Zinger Folkman, the development plan and all of the actions after?
All the other stuff, good stuff too. I think it's important to recognize, before I answer your question, that Zinger Folkman put 2 years of research into the development of the tool that we use. 2 years, not just 2 months, but 2 years. And they looked at over 22,000 leaders, and they looked at over 44 different assessments to decide what are the things that make the biggest difference when it comes to leadership development and what doesn't. And so when you look at their competency list, it's because they're statistically relevant. That's why they're called differentiating competencies. That's what we're asking people to assess on, not all the things that we could call leadership. Even executive presence, Mike, is not in there because it's not a differentiating competency. Do people need to know how to show up in the boardroom? Yes, of course. That's part of it. But we only assess what we know is a competency that's statistically relevant.
Okay.
And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that the assessment report, as you've been through it yourself personally, is really not the most important thing. The assessment report is the starter of development. And so we use it in that manner to say, okay, what did we learn and what can we take out of this that allows us to look at the strengths that we have and how we can build on those strengths to help them become profound. Why do we do that? Well, first of all, we use a strength-based development tool, not a weakness development tool, on purpose, because we know that the best leaders, the most extraordinary leaders in the United States and around the world globally, are the ones that have 3 to 5 profound strengths, that they have 3 to 5 competencies that they do as well as anyone in the world, in the top 10% of the world. Those people are considered extraordinary time and time again when the assessment is done, and Zinger Folkman can point to that. So the goal isn't to eliminate a weakness or several weaknesses. The goal is to build on these strengths so that they become so profound that that's what attracts people to us as leaders. Our influence comes through our relationships, and our relationships are developed based on the competencies that we can bring into the workplace, but they're all unique. Your 3 to 5 leadership competencies that you do the best at are going to be very different than mine.
Right.
And each leader needs to pursue it in their own way.
Yeah.
When it really makes the most difference, the 3 to 5 things that are your biggest strengths are also the most needed in the role that you have. So as CEO of TMI, there are certain things that you need to be doing that are very different than me being a CEO. And when your strengths match those needs of the organization, that's when you see it to really start to sing, because people are like, wow, Mike is really good at what he does, because there's this uniformity between the need of the business and what you bring to the role.
Yeah. And you said the output is just the way I kind of view this, Don, and you and I have talked about this a little bit before, that a 360 opens up the door to feedback and self-assessment and self-awareness. But if you only open up a door and don't go into the room where the impact really takes place, which is the whole, you get the feedback, there's the upfront process, there's the feedback of opening the door to all of this feedback. Then you got to step in the room and you have to begin a development process and a coaching process to focus on strengths, refine areas, and work as a leader and grow and develop, which many organizations, I think, make a mistake of only getting the feedback, not creating the action plan that needs to follow over the next 1, 2, or 5 years.
Correct.
Can you share a little bit of your thoughts on that part of the process as well?
How many days do you have?
Right. Right.
I know. I think we share the same view, and it's just so, it's a little bit boring. I apologize to your listeners because it isn't as, I get very excited about it, but it's because it's hard work. It doesn't really sound that great to people. So the hard work part of it is we call it practice. And that's what we believe is that if we're trying to develop, we're trying to practice a skill, perhaps an emerging strength that we're trying to turn into a profound strength. And what does practice look like could be the question, right? Practice looks like if you're let's just take an example. If you're working with inspires and motivates others to high performance, you know that competency well yourself. If you're trying to develop that, the question is, what do you do this week to practice that skill, right?
Yeah.
Which is a great question. And this is where the rubber meets the road, because when you answer that question, you have it predetermined and locked into your to-dos or your meeting schedule, and you know exactly what you're going to do to practice that competency, you have the opportunity for improvement. And the best leaders that we've worked with are people that week in and week out make a decision about where they're going to practice and then go out and actually practice it. And then at the end of the week, they reflect on how that practice went. I think about a football team. We would never expect a professional football team to play a game without reviewing their game films, right?
Right.
And so we ask all of our clients to slow down at the end of the week to go back to their so-called game film and think about what did they do, how did it work, and what could they do different next time. This trains the mind to be reflective and to think about how did I do that in a learning format as opposed to, is it a report card? And every time our leaders spend time reflecting and seeing themselves in action in these practice opportunities, they pick up something like, that was really good the way that I asked that question, or I could have spent more time with them being curious about what they're up to, and so because we're asking the hard questions and reflecting on our practice, that's where the intense learning takes place.
Yeah.
And over the course of a year or so, like you said, if you're doing that every week, if you've had 50 opportunities to practice and assess your practice, you have a tremendous amount of growth. Yeah. And then we prove that with the follow-up assessment, because we always like to do the back-end assessment, which allows people to see how much room for improvement that they've created in their life and their leadership practice.
Yeah, I think this is part of the essence of true executive and career and next level coaching, right? That this approach of every athlete goes and takes reps at whatever they're doing every week, in order to show up to the performance, the competition, the meet, the match, etc. You can't get there unless you're getting the reps. So you're referencing getting the reps. We've got to just get reps and think of it's not negative to be told you need to get more reps. We need more reps as leaders, and we need to think about the reflections of, well, when I took those 10 reps, I probably could improve a little bit. The last 10 meetings I was in, how did I respond? Did I watch my tongue? Did I take over the meeting? Did I agree with everything because it was coming from my mouth? Or did I disagree with some of the decisions that were being made and I held my tongue because I want my team to experience? I said just in the last few days, I've learned in the role that I'm in, I can very quickly take over a meeting because I'm so passionate about what I do.
Wait a minute, you're just learning that now?
Well, you taught me that 17 years ago when I did my first 360. But what I've learned is it's okay that I don't make 95% of the decisions, right? And it's okay. It's more than okay. It's energizing and empowering to those in the room when they're making 95% of the decisions. Yeah. 95% of the time, those decisions are going to be 100% right, even though they may have been different than the direction I would have taken. And that's leadership. So when you step in the room, learning for me and my personality and my strengths, I have to really force the dialogue to take place here, not here, right? And let people have the discussions. And at the end of the day, I don't ever want to be the smartest person in the room. And I want a team of inspired humans who they may be smarter than me, but we've got to be careful as energized, enthusiastic, and visionary leaders to not disengage everyone versus engage everyone. So that engagement process of what employee engagement really looks like, what team member engagement really looks like, I want everyone's voice. And I've had to learn, like, I have an amazing team of humans who come alongside of all of our work. People ask us often, Don, how do you get so much accomplished? And it's because, have you seen the team that's accomplishing greatness, right? But I share this in that naturally, early in my career, I thought I had to be right to prove something. And I thought I had to be the loudest one in the room. And I'm sure that some of us listening have that same personality. Others of us listening and watching to this, you're like, yeah, I'm in a room all the time with someone like that who hasn't quite figured this out. But that's the learning of the strength of the visionary leader, that like, okay, now how do I maximize that?
Right.
Right. And what does maximizing look like?
What's interesting, and maybe, I don't know if you're helping us go there with your own confession, so to speak.
I'm trying.
But think about it this way, that even if you were practicing not showing up and taking over the meeting, you would still have to get to something else, right? That you couldn't just say, I'm going to do that, and it would just change. Like, habits don't just start. Correct. Or new habits don't begin just because we want them to. So part of the challenge that we help our clients with from a coaching perspective is saying, hey, Mike, in the past, do you have any idea why you've done that? Like, what was the reason why you felt this need to speak first and to maybe say a lot during a meeting? Like, what was going on inside of you that allowed you to show up that way, that empowered you actually to show up that way? And part of it is going to be style, because style is always a big part of it. But the other part of it is just that sometimes we've got a psychology that behind that. There's a mindset. And I would have guessed, knowing you just a little bit, that part of it would be you're young and you didn't want to be perceived as young and not knowing what you needed to know. Like you're not smart enough, not wise enough, not, and so there's this temptation to dip into that pool of like, well, I've got to show up and talk more so that people don't judge me as not being worthy.
Right.
And what's fun about coaching, what I love about it is like we can talk about that stuff, which is really close to the heart,
right,
and where the habit needs to be reformed, right? If we can change that mindset of why did you have that habit in the past, it makes the practice a lot easier. Practice is absolutely necessary, don't get me wrong, but the mindset that goes along with the old habit that you're trying to change absolutely is where the money is made in terms of coaching.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm going to go here, we're going to keep going here to live out this experience. I'm an ENTJ on the Myers-Briggs.
Okay.
I've always been a high D. I've had to work really hard to get my S and C to come up a little bit. So high D, high S. Early to mid-career professionals, I believe for the most part, when you come to the table, there's two different personality types. There's one that I'm reserved and nobody wants my feedback. And because nobody's asking me. So I'm not going to share my feedback because you're not engaging me and asking for my feedback. And I've gotten coaching throughout my career as a leader to work to draw out the feedback from everyone in the room, right? So that's a skill to draw out. It's even a skill to figure out who's not communicating in the meeting, who may be the smartest one on this topic or may have the most great insights because they're on the, let's say, the front line of actually what's going on, but we just ignore, right? We had to work really hard on this over the last several years as more has gone virtual to engage an entire virtual room, but most humans couldn't engage an entire in-person room in the first place, right? So I've had to work on that as a leader, because my personality is to show up. And again, a little bit of ego, a lot of pride that I've had to work on and pray about and have my own life transformed around that. Like, that's not necessary. It's not necessary to bring those into conversations. there's a purpose element that you've helped me with over the years. There's a journaling element that you've helped me with over the years of like, why are we really here? It's not to prove that we should be in the room.
Right.
But when you're a young professional who ascends to leadership fairly quickly, all of a sudden you start looking around the room and go, everyone's 10 to 20 years my senior.
Yes.
And there are people in the room, by the way, who do judge you because of age.
Correct.
Right? So there you're trying to like show that, oh, don't judge. There's this whole dynamic, including when you're a young professional. You know what the worst thing to call a young professional is? A young professional,
Yeah.
right? So,
Exactly.
so this is this journey of what it feels like, and the conversations and the empathy we all need to have of like, there's hopefully people who are watching this that are going, yeah, I'm the quiet one that nobody on my team ever asks my perspective. And we would be coaching you to lean in with confidence, to gain more confidence, to start showing up, start asking questions, start engaging differently. The next thing you know, your manager or the leadership team may go, where did she come from? Where has she been? And that's the kind of confidence we want to build into the leaders that we're supporting. Then you have some of us who have a naturally stronger personality. I have a 17-year-old son who just took his first Myers-Briggs, who guess what he is? An ENTJ. And guess what happens? He dominates every room, right? His teachers have told him and worked with him of like, hey, and he is naturally inquisitive. One of the oldest soul, like he's inquisitive. He's asking big questions. And they had to say, like, we don't want to stop you from asking questions. Just make sure you give everyone else the opportunity to ask questions too, right? And I get emotional about it because I've received that feedback too, right? Coaching is real. And now I find myself 20 years later, he's my 17-year-old son, giving him the feedback. Like, it's okay to have a perspective. Just make sure the rest of the room shares their perspective. And he's learning this, and to see him work that muscle around feedback is incredible, right? And to start using the tools that you've given me, that I've been afforded the opportunity for a lot of assessments over the years. I feel like I've taken not every one that's out there, because every week we find out about a new assessment somebody's using. But that self-assessment piece is so important, and self-awareness is okay. Don't judge yourself about the feedback you're going to get from self-awareness, but have a good coach that you can trust and rely on, that's supportive, that cares about your long-term potential and views you as a human.
Right.
And again, this is what coaching looks like, right? Our mission of connecting businesses with the talent and resources necessary to help you achieve your vision and unlocking human potential are what Centennial and Talent Magnet Institute have been all about now for a collective 55 years. Centennial celebrates our 50th year, TMI is going into our 5th year, and we are ready to help you and your team get to the next level of strategy, vision, and achievement. Feel free to reach out and send us a note, and let's have a conversation.
I love what you're saying. I hope the audience gets this, that the assessment of oneself can feel a little awkward, kind of like where we started this conversation, but it's absolutely necessary to assess, to get that feedback so that our self-awareness grows. Because without an awareness of our style, pluses and minuses, because all styles have both of those, right? Unless we really own that space, unless we really know it, we really can't adjust it. We can't really do leadership formation. So, to the whole audience, like if you haven't done what Mike just talked about, if you haven't looked at your Myers-Briggs or a DISC or a social style or Enneagram, all these great assessments, if you really haven't owned that space yet, that's a great place to start, because if you can't see it, you can't fix it. You can't make it better. But if you see it and own the space because you've got good data that tells you about your style and makes sense, then you can do something with it. When you said I'm an ENTJ, you didn't just say that as those 4 initials, but I think you're owning that space, saying like my extroversion, the E part of it, makes me comfortable talking all the time, and therefore I do. And so for me to be a great leader, I'm going to have to be aware of that and sometimes pull that back. That's how we use the data from an assessment in real life. But that's not what a lot of people do. They walk around saying, I'm an ENTJ, and they just continue.
Accept it.
Yeah, they just act that way all the time.
You all should accept it, right?
This is me.
So let's talk a little bit about derailers
Sure.
or fatal flaws. I was sharing in a recent episode. I was at a conference that Peyton Manning was the speaker. So I'm going to share this story again.
Sure.
Peyton Manning was standing up and he almost flew in the face of strengths-based leadership. And that was his intention, because his comment was, when we watch tape, when my competitors watch tape, they know my strengths. They exploit and attack my weaknesses. So his feedback was, to everyone who's only focusing on your strengths and you're just telling everyone in the world that, these are my strengths. So this is all I focus on. And you're not paying attention to your weaknesses. Your weaknesses are what's going to take you down. If they know when I do this, when I lead with this foot, when they get me to throw from this particular angle, it's my weakness. So what are they doing? They're pushing me in a box to focus on my weakness. So I have to get reps to get better so that my weaknesses aren't as weak. And I build the team around me that they can help support my weakness, because I don't want to throw off that one foot. So I need a line that protects me so I never have to, right? But go with me on this around the theory of, don't just focus on your strengths. What about your derailers and fatal flaws? And how do I work on those when they show up? Because we know, Don, every time someone opens the scores on their 360, what's the first thing they do? Unfortunately, we all go to our weaknesses.
Always.
We shouldn't, but we always do. So share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the term fatal flaw sounds pretty demonstrative, and maybe the audience is like, what is that? That's odd. What Mike's referring to is that we work towards profound strengths, but we're also aware of this thing called a fatal flaw, which is considered to be a flaw in the most important or most critical skills and competencies that are needed for the particular role that you're in. And so let's just pretend as we're talking to a CEO and makes decisions is something that's really critical for their organization and for his role. And he scores in the lowest dimension of the entire demographics, and he's at the bottom 10%. That's considered a fatal flaw, something that is really critical to his work, to his role. He does at a very low level. And because it's so important and done so poorly, it overshadows everything else. So that one particular outage is the main thing that everyone that works with him sees. And so they can't even begin to see strengths that this person has because they are asphyxiated on that one particular outage.
Gotcha.
It might seem unfair, but it's human behavior that we all look for something, especially from the big jobs like the C-suite. And we want them to behave in a certain manner. And when they don't, when that one thing keeps blinking at us, that's all we see the entire time. So that can overshadow their effectiveness in every facet of what they do as a leader. I like to think of it as a cancer. It's a tumor that you have, and it's been identified. We now know where that tumor is. And so, of course, if you had a good doctor, they're going to go after that tumor. They're going to cut it out as quickly as possible. That's what we do as coaches as well. If there is a fatal flaw, we want to identify it accurately, then go in after it, cut it out by helping the person understand what they do and how they can change that behavior, and then practice very rigorously until that fatal flaw no longer haunts them.
Yeah.
And I've seen tremendous improvement with people that go after it. And I've also seen, I remember this one person who told me that she wanted to work on a different competency than her fatal flaw. And I recommended that she did not do that. I said, what we've seen is that those things need to be dismissed until they're gone, because if you don't, they'll hang around. She said, but I really want to do this for these reasons. And I said, it's up to you, of course. You choose. You're the client. And 6 months later, she called back and she was angry because she had done her reassessment. I said, what's wrong? She said, did you see my scores? I said, yeah, I did. But why are you so upset? She said, my scores aren't any better. Are you kidding me? What the heck? And I said, well, what did you do? I knew what she did, but I wanted her to say it. Well, I worked on this. And I said, well, was that your fatal flaw? She said, no. Well, I told you I was going to do that. I said, well, I'm glad that you told me, but what? I mean, you missed the opportunity to fix that fatal flaw, and now it's still haunting you 6 to 9 months later, and it always will. So we know that again, the data is so good, it's so rich, it's so accurate that when that's identified, you just have to get after it. And you need a good coach to figure out how to get rid of it, because it doesn't go away on its own.
Yeah, I love building out this analogy a tad bit. So if we're not taking reps in a certain muscle group or a certain habit, and we're not executing on that habit. Like, so for example, if I say, I know I need to journal and I know I need to express more gratitude to get my mindset in a healthier position, we believe that with self-care and well-being, gratitude journaling is critical, and it's a habit you have to create to be more positive. So naturally leaning to every day being more positive. I've used often the discussion, every time you walk through a doorway, express one thing you're thankful for. That's a coach recommended that to me, and it's gotten me in a habit of remembering. Do I do it every single doorway? No, but I do remember this, that I equip others with that feedback.
Sure.
So I've worked on gratitude journaling. If I were a naturally negative person and I'm not working on expressing gratitude, if I never express gratitude and work on gratitude journaling, I'll never not be as negative as I always am. Therefore, I show up and say, well, you're still you still lead with negativity. Well, of course I do, because I haven't worked on being grateful, right? And that's what you're saying. So if we derail and focus on something because it feels easier and not focus on the harder thing that we really need to work on, and don't have a coach supporting us and encouraging us along the way, don't be surprised if your fatal flaw or weaknesses never get stronger, right? You can't be surprised by that. Certainly she couldn't be totally surprised by that. She can be upset about it because she thought through osmosis it was going to have a ripple effect and adjust this. But the reality is it's not, unless you go for it.
No.
And in order to go for it, you got to acknowledge it, accept it, which is a big deal with leadership.
Right.
Accepting the things that we're hearing. You don't have to agree with them. But the reality is, when you get a 360, you don't have to agree with them, but it is real.
Right.
People are being open and transparent to give feedback to help you, not to attack you.
I love to ask the question when people get their feedback, like, hey, the feedback, what do you think? Is it the truth? And they look at me like, is it the truth? What do you mean? I'm like, well, is it the truth? And I'm like, well, maybe. And I, is it or isn't it? It isn't, because it's people's perceptions, and that isn't always the truth, because there's something beyond that. But often there's so much richness in it, because as a leader, we want to know what other people perceive us, and it's their reality. And so maybe it's not the truth, but it's the most vibrant form of feedback that we can possibly get, because it lets us know exactly how people see our strengths and opportunities. And because of that, it's incredibly useful. The other thing that comes out a lot, Mike, and I think maybe this might be good for your audience, is that we see time and time again when we look at our self scores compared to everyone else's scores, that there's a gap, pretty sizable gap. And if you're looking at 19 different competencies and you've got 19 pretty good sized gaps, that might say a lot about who you are. I find a lot of people today have the phenomenon of never being good enough. And it's so incredibly overwhelming that when you see your scores are below everyone else's, that you probably have lived with that most of your life. In fact, I say that to a lot of clients. Hey, has this been something you've lived with your whole life? And they've said, oh yeah, absolutely. So that in itself can be a huge benefit of getting the feedback, because you need to start to work on that mindset of never being good enough. It's perfectionism, right? That's really what it is. And so many of us are challenged with that mindset that keeps us from not being good enough. Why is this important? Well, I love humility. Humility absolutely is important. Good to great Jim Collins, taught us that 20 plus years ago. But there's a fake humility when we're always significantly lower than how other people see us. And why that's important for a leader is that I believe one of the greatest things as leaders is we need to own our gifts. We need to own what each and every one of them is and what it looks like and what it feels like. And then we need to give those gifts away, because they're not meant for us. They're meant for the people that we lead. And good leaders get this. And when you don't know what your gifts are, or you don't own them because you're never good enough, you're not giving anything away. You're holding it all back in. So one of the things we often do is in that very last page of the assessment is like help people reflect on, how do you see yourself in the light of having gifts, true gifts that need to be given away to others, because that's what a gift really is. So I think that's one of the things that people don't even think about. And in the end, they're like, wow, that was really a breakthrough for me when I noticed that I rate myself that way.
So is it helping leaders view those things with more confidence? Is it and or, are there leaders that walk around almost self-deprecating and they're hurting their own strengths because of how they're approaching life? Like, unpack that a little bit more for us.
No, I think it really starts at understanding our core beliefs, otherwise called schemas. So if you look at the core beliefs that we hold about ourselves, they're often very much aligned to how we rate ourselves in a 360.
Okay.
So if our perception is close to how other people perceive us, we probably have a pretty adequate, we show up in an adequate manner. But if we're not good enough, it's because we have a much higher standard than everyone else has. And that comes from a belief about perfectionism. Like I must always be perfect, or others will not accept me. I must always be perfect or not make a mistake, or else they won't trust me. Or we say things like that to ourselves all the time. And our core beliefs, if we analyze them, will demonstrate a lot in terms of how we treat ourselves and treat others. There's a great book called Never Good Enough by Dr. Basco. And I recommend that to everybody. If you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful paperback that Dr. Basco has and has lots of assessments in it and ways to understand what you're doing with your perfectionism. Because there's a good side to perfectionism, let's be clear. But then there's also a downside to perfectionism that gets in the way for a lot of people.
Do you find that in those situations, the team has the most realistic view and the individual has a distorted view because of the schemas that they've grown up with, the personal talk tracks? Like, what have you found? Have you tried to bring them up and more aligned to what?
Yeah, I think it's a both and. It's hard to say one or the other. I do believe that the individual, because if you've identified your inside mind, the thoughts that you have all the time, accurately, you might actually know yourself better than others because you know what that noise is about, the positive and the negative. But then also people can help us see what some of those gifts are that maybe we're denying ourselves. So you have to think about it both ways, I believe.
Okay. Don, what are we seeing and experiencing real time with teams? And I can just think of all of the opportunities we've had working with organizations and all the different team makeups, from geographic location, disbursement, hybrid, in person, all the dynamics going on in the world, international companies becoming international over the last several years through acquisitions, companies who are international growing organically and inorganically. The word that comes to everyone's mind is just the state of change, right? There's so much going on with the state of change in all aspects of, even in personal lives, and all the different dynamics that filter into, think of all the changes that our families have experienced the last 5 years. How are we seeing that show up, and what do you think are the critical skills, learnings, and takeaways that you're trying to instill in the clients you're supporting around the topic of change?
What an easy question.
Just the softball. That's what we're here for.
My goodness, that's loaded.
We have time.
Yes. So. A couple things occurred to me as you're asking the question. I think part of the challenge of executive teams, which is where I spend a lot of my time, is that I will ask them to describe to me their team. And if you're the CFO, you're going to tell me about the finance department and the accounting department and the payroll department and all the people that report into your overall team. And then I'll ask the question, well, tell me more about your team. And they'll say, I just did. What I'm trying to draw their attention to is that they actually have another team that they don't identify as their team. And that's the peer group that they have. And what's fascinating to me, and I've experienced it myself, so this is not, I'm not shaming anybody because I've been right there. It's really interesting to think about the team that reports to you as being your team, and the team that you have to suffer with and put up with is your peers. But we know in most highly functional organizations that team, your peer team, has to be high performing for your team to be high performing, that they actually work together. So when dysfunction is occurring, it's often because the peers at a C level are not getting together, not working together synergistically. They're running their own parts of the organization, and they're very independent from one another. And we would call that a group. We wouldn't call that a team, would we? Even though we call it the executive team. So I think the challenge is to focus the hardest part and the most important part of an organization on how do we behave as a team? What rules of engagement do we have as an executive team to work together to run the business collectively? And that doesn't mean that, you as a chief marketing officer just go off and do your marketing things, and me as a CFO go off and do my finance thing. It's how do we collaborate? How do we work together? And so collaboration and teamwork is a huge issue across the board.
Yeah.
Being able to develop trust with one another, being able to support and encourage one another. The best organizations are not worried about protecting their own resources and their own budgets, but they're trying to figure out how can I help everyone else in the organization so that we can accomplish our goals. And they own the goals of the organization collectively. They don't own their slice of the goals independently. And that's hard to do. It's easy to talk about, but it's very, very difficult to put together.
Right. I will add, if you just listen to what Don just shared, and you're like, that's us, that's where we are, please hear us, and that you're not unique. And this is what many organizations are dealing with. And it's okay. Like, there's a part of it, like, you need to accept it, that is what it is. And what I just heard were things that Don shared that we should be working on to be more collaborative, to be more functional, and go from being a group to a team, right? And this collaboration, this trust, this relationship with my peers of like, we're all in, we may lead a function, but we're all responsible to lead and achieve a strategy. And a strategy was never achieved without humans. Like, you can't automate achieving a strategy. And so I just want to mention that, because I think some would hear this and go, gosh, that's us. We're so dysfunctional. Well, guess what? We all have our own dysfunctions, right? Every team has their dysfunctions. Every family has their dysfunctions. Welcome to being human and having flaws, right? And we're not perfect. And we were never promised we would be perfect. And we were always promised we would have challenges. So just hear us in that, but also we want to help you become and increase your effectiveness. You may have never even seen this modeled before, to be honest, which is part of why we're on a mission at Talent Magnet Institute. Like, it's literally why we exist, that there are not enough positive models to learn from. What I love is when you see a team that's like, you know what, we're going to actually invest in this topic. Mm-hmm. You're telling us that our performance is going to increase because we're not working as effectively. And yet we've been blaming the functions of, if that team would just figure themselves out, they'd be more effective. And why are they doing and all these excuses? We are telling you, if you work as a leadership team on yourselves, it will have a transformative cascading effect. And you may actually get applauses and cheers from the rest of your org chart, because they're finally seeing you model the behavior that you're expecting from them, but you're not modeling. Is that?
Yeah, no doubt. I think you're right. I mean, make it real. Like, if there's a sales problem, if your revenue is not growing to the degree that you've said that you need it to grow to be a healthy business, it's easy to point the finger to say, the person in charge of sales, you're not getting it done. And there's truth to that, right? Mm-hmm. That's where the rubber meets the road, right there. But for the rest of the executive team, just to point the finger at that person and to say, well, this will get fixed only when he takes or she takes care of the problem, that's actually irrelevant to the collective group being able to step up and say, how do we make this better? What do we need? We need to collectively do to make that happen.
Right.
Not just what do you need to do? And there's such a huge difference in terms of how effective businesses get run, is that we cannot just rely on pointing the finger at each other and expecting that highly talented people are always going to have the right answers and have the right resources to get it done.
So one of the hardest parts about podcasting is the moment you stop talking. I mean, think about it. The majority of the work that you probably put into creating a podcast is in the editing phase. So what if you didn't have to do the editing phase? Here at the Cincinnati Podcast Studio, we help you just come in and talk. We do all the rest. We have the cameras, we have the microphones, we have the lights, and then we have the editing tools to create the perfect content out of your podcast. Not only do you get the full podcast in video and audio, you also get short form content that you can use across all of your pages in social media. So if you want to learn more, go to CincinnatiPodcastStudio.com/tour to learn more and schedule your tour with us today.
When you hear people describe their team, I always hone in on, are they just describing competency? Mm. So are they describing the functions that make up their team? Or are they also sharing the chemistry and culture of that team that exists? Do they know their people? I'm listening for, do they know their people? I was just with a client who was doing a plant tour, and we shared with him, this is one of the most inspiring plant tours we've taken in X amount of months, because one, the CEO wasn't the one doing the tour. He had someone else take the tour and guide us through the tour. And said someone else was literally just showing up in rooms of people. Like they would show up in a cell in this manufacturing plant and just, hey, I want to introduce you to Mike and Becky. And everyone was so excited that Mike and Becky were here. And they weren't like, why are you here? Why are you, I'm scared. You're walking around me. What is this? It was like, oh, and it just an immediate introduction to the work they're doing and what they're responsible for and what they're excited about. I mean, it was like you could tell it wasn't staged, but you could also tell that this is the culture they have. This is when the CEO is taking a new group through their plant. He has someone else take the tour and they walk around, and it's like, you feel like you should just, everybody's just waving to each other and sharing what they're doing. And the transparency, the vulnerability, the openness is so different than a tour that you take where every time you walk in the room, you can tell people are like, are they here to fire me? Are they here to reprimand me? And we look at those things. So when we ask about team description, we want to understand chemistry and culture, right? We want to understand, what is it? No, I understand I asked about your team and you walked me through the functions, but tell me about your team. What are they working on? What are they struggling with? What are the greatest opportunities that exist? And what are the barriers you're trying to overcome? Because at the end of the day, those are the things that your coaching and leadership support are trying to do. From Centennial's perspective, when we're recruiting executives into that team, we want to understand the vision of where you're going, and we want to understand the obstacles that you're trying to overcome. Because that's the kind of leader you want to implant into that environment, who can help you get to where you're going by coming through the water that you're wading through.
It's interesting that you're kind of, it sounds a little bit soft, to be quite honest. Like you're talking about
Welcome to my world.
Yeah, right. It's like, it doesn't sound very tangible and I'm sure many of the listeners like, what was he talking about? Like, this is apple pie and motherhood, right? But there's an energy, and maybe that's the word we could use to help the audience really get, like, there definitely is an energy, when you walk into the place that you're just talking about versus other businesses. You can feel defensiveness, you can feel fear, you can feel anxiety in some places, right? As soon as you walk in. And then you can also feel what you just described, that there's this incredible joy and fulfillment and people enjoying the work and supporting each other and collaboration at the same time. So, which would you rather have? Of course, we all want the latter, but how do you develop it? And that's part of what creating a great culture is. And maybe that's where you're leading us in this conversation, is that leadership has to own the culture, and whichever version of the culture is there is because of the way that they're leading.
Yeah. And culture is not what you think culture is. Culture is made up of the thousands and thousands of experiences of what everyone else experiences. So I can say as a leader, here's what I expect our culture to be. And we get that. You and I have sat in rooms where leaders have told us, well, here's what my culture is. And you're like, I understand that's what you want it to be, but what's actually being lived out and experienced? So you can feel when you're in the culture business, when you're in the soft and fuzzy business of helping teams increase effectiveness by wanting to work together more effectively. And what does that look like? And how do we do that? And how do we build relationships and trust versus everybody's in their corner afraid to push a button because they don't know if it's the right button. And it's really interesting with teams, right? And the more dispersed we are as organizations, as functions, the more we're traveling, the more we're navigating from different locations and sites. How do you pull it all together to where we actually want to support one another versus we're just in our own individual silos? So you're right. A lot of people don't understand it because they don't work in an environment where that's a focal point. We always say we want to work with organizations who want to either lean into this side of the conversation or they're doing some really great stuff and they just want to continue to further amplify and unlock the teams that they have and their effectiveness. And they know they could bring some other creativity to the discussion.
Right. It's fascinating to me that we say things like culture eats strategy for breakfast and things like that. And just meaning the importance of culture is so incredible. But I don't understand why more people don't work on that. And if it really is that strong of a factor, why wouldn't a CEO or a C-suite team want to know what the culture is and really spend a lot of energy on making the culture the way that they want it to be? It's fascinating to me because we talk to so many businesses, and that's the last thing that they really want to invest in to work on, even though they admit that it's really important. So I don't understand it. Do you ever have any thoughts about why that is? Or
yeah, it's a great question of why they're sitting in that camp. Those who have seen it actually play out are more likely to lean towards, I want that here too. So I think it's unfortunate. And I use the phrase often, like it's unfortunate the way that we've approached the industrial revolution way of working. And there are leaders who want to lead differently. There are leaders who want to be the leader they wish showed up 20 years ago. So the reason why they're leading the way they're leading is because nobody ever led them the way they think they should be leading their teams. And they were bold enough to say, I'm going to lead differently. I'm going to put the time in. I'm going to take an outdoor adventure experience with my team because I know that coming out of that 4-hour session, we're going to know each other more, trust each other more, and believe in each other more. We have teams who lean in. I shared a recent example in a couple of episodes ago where a leader said they actually apologized to me about the tough, uncomfortable conversation that they had in front of me that I was facilitating to draw out, because we can tell when I don't think they've ever discussed that. And you know what? I'm going to put this right in the table and we're going to invest in that conversation because we, as experts in this space, know unless we talk about that, we're never going to get through this wall. And our goal is to get we don't have to agree on all of the problems that exist with this topic. But the fact that we've never discussed it and disagreed openly is holding you back from change and holding you back from forward movement. And by the way, when you're a leader in this particular space and you're not addressing the things that really need to be addressed, everyone else knows about it. So you trying to hide it and tuck it away and not address it, all of your functions, layers and layers below you at the leadership level, they know because they can feel that this is what's holding everything back.
That's right.
And it's actually, and all of a sudden we're pitting functions against each other, and your leader isn't connecting with your leader. And that's the reason why we can't get our job done effectively. Again, you're not abnormal if that's the culture you're in. We're saying there is 100% better way to navigate through this. And there is a little bit of trust factor. I mean, Don, how many times have you and I sat with a leader virtually or in person where they're hesitant to say yes to our work, but then they go talk to references and they're like, gosh, if you can do that, well, we want that, right? It's okay to lean into the uncomfortable. Not everything in leadership is supposed to be comfortable.
Well, leadership is the hardest job.
Yeah.
And people say, well, I want to be a leader. It's like, well,
Are
do
you
you know
sure?
what do you know what you're signing up for? Because
Right.
it's so, there's so many edges to it that are rough and sharp. And, you're often the individual that isn't embraced because you had to make a difficult decision and no one else wanted to make it, but you had to do it. And people don't give you a lot of benefit for doing that. And it's just hard work. It really is. It's so gratifying when done well. But when not done well, it can be painful beyond any other thing you've ever done.
Yeah. Stepping into the uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Honestly, getting reps on things that are uncomfortable. If you've never done it, it's uncomfortable to create an argument. Again, you may even say, why would I create an argument in the workplace? I don't mean a negative, like we're going to argue and fight. I mean, we're going to lay out an argument that needs to be discussed. Sometimes it is okay to not fully agree, but 100% actively disagreeing and never engaging in something that needs to be discussed is not okay for your culture. And again, 360s will tell you that everybody else knows about it. Everyone else knows about it. Everyone can feel the energy, the negative energy out of the room because we're not addressing the actual problems that would help us achieve a customer problem that's keeping us from reaching our 3-year business strategy, that's holding us back from accomplishing our 90-day rocks. Like we're saying, we want to help you build the reps to learn how to lean into that so you can be a better, more transparent, more effective leader, right? So people don't do it because they haven't seen it. They haven't gotten any training on how to lean into uncomfortable conversations. Mm-hmm. And they also have grown up in cultures that we just don't do that, right? We don't question things. We don't challenge people. And guess what? We're all supposed to be a little bit questioned and challenged on things. And that's how you get stronger and better together. So I hope that is clear that, again, this is very normal for somebody to be listening to this dialogue and going, gosh, that's us, that's us, that's us. Write it down, document it, be self-aware, accept that your brain is telling you, that's me. I need to get stronger on that. And then have a conversation with experts that this is literally what we do. We increase your effectiveness and your enjoyment working with the teams and colleagues that you have by having these dialogues. And I tell people often, I mean, the rowing analogy, rowing teams, watching a rowing team is one of the most inspiring in motion experiences anyone can ever have. In fact, just in a few weeks, I'm going to be speaking at a business fraternity at Clemson University. And one of my friends said, when you're at Clemson, most of the time their waterways have rowing teams on it. And I'm like, oh, I can't wait for this. I may even do a live podcast from that if they are on the waterways, because it's just so incredible. It's something of beauty when you watch a rowing team just drift across the water in cadence. Most leadership teams are fighting each other with their oars, right? And boats are going all opposite ways. They're not smooth sailing.
Right.
You don't get smooth sailing in a rowing team without reps and constant cadence and reps. And we want to help leaders get those cadence and reps so you can move further, faster. And all of a sudden you're like, I don't even know how we got here. How do we speed up that quick? Well, because you're talking about the things that need to be addressed and you're willing to work on it. So
it's a great point. I think the in the Midwest, where we're at here in Cincinnati, there's a Midwest nice factor, which you've heard about. I'm sure many of the audience members have heard about too, where, we'll seemingly agree to one another in a meeting, walk out and say, no way in hell am I doing that. It's like, what was that all about? Like, we, face to face, we pretend like we're in agreement, but we're not, because we don't know how to have that conversation you just talked about, Mike. We're not willing to have a difficult conversation, a debate, one where we have to really challenge the content, not the person, just to say we've got to make the best decision. And we're not doing it if we just listen to one person say, this is what we should do.
Yeah. I mentioned to leaders of where does your most challenging and direct feedback come from? And what I look for is I want to see at what levels is it okay? Right. And if somebody says, well, recently my electrician, an inside sales rep, brought up this idea that like flew in the face of what we all thought, but it's actually right. And she's only been with us for 3 months or 3 years. You've created a trustworthy environment where people can share their perspectives. If somebody says nobody ever brings up ideas here, there may be a reason. because you as the leader, nobody wants to share any ideas with you. Think about how painful that is.
That's right.
If you as the leader are not hearing ideas, challenges, things that could become innovations, well, you've set up your zone where nobody wants to give you feedback. Because anytime somebody gives you feedback, you just rip them apart or discard them so quickly. Why would I ever do that again? Right? And Don, we experience this often with leaders that we're trying to coach to like navigate through that. The only way to do it is to start being really vulnerable and open. And sometimes, as Becky Sheeler shared in a recent podcast, sometimes as leaders, we have to say, I made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I've changed my opinion. I apologize for the way I came across in these 5 instances because of that self-reflection. And that's what a great coach can help you with.
It's a good point. Just this week, I was talking to a long-term client that I've had, a super smart individual, just have so much respect for him, PhD and MD, just incredible. But he had a meeting last week that wasn't great. And I got feedback about it through another channel. And I encouraged that person to talk directly to him, which they did. And then this week we talked about, so what's the next appropriate action? And we talked about the heartfelt apology, like how can you go back to that team? And then we also unpacked why was he feeling that way. He really felt like the meeting was unprepared. The people weren't ready to achieve a great meeting, and that frustrated him because they've been talking about that. And but he personally didn't come across the best possible way he could. And so he's going to start with an apology for his behavior, and then he's going to jump into, so let's talk about the meeting also, because we really didn't hit the mark on that either, did we? So he's got to do both things. They're both uncomfortable. And to your point, they both require vulnerability.
Yeah. And what do you anticipate the outcome of that discussion to be?
If he does the apology really well, and if there's a pause between the apology and the let's take a look at how we behaved as a team, if he doesn't try to wash away the apology with, well, let me tell you what you guys didn't do, it'll be very positive. But the apology is everything. I really think that we're not trying to be perfect human beings. We're trying to be human beings that are imperfect and have to sometimes apologize to each other. And if we do that really well, it's one of the best leadership acts there is.
What holds a leader back from accepting that they don't have to be perfect, that we're actually designed to be imperfect and have flaws? What holds leaders back from accepting that?
Perfectionism.
Okay.
It's all those core beliefs that make me believe that since I've got this big title, whatever that is, I should be the smartest, I should be the most together, I should be the best, I should be the whatever it is. And it's just not true. It's a lie.
What can we do as we're wrapping up this conversation to work on that if I find myself in that place? And what do I do if I have someone around me who I feel like is that way? Not trying to be judgy, but boy, if that leader would back away from the perfectionism, the ego that comes with that discussion, how do I help someone navigate through that?
Yeah. It begins again with self-awareness, where we talked earlier, and understanding what our core beliefs that drive our perfectionism to the degree that it becomes ineffective. And so if we can understand the things that I've been saying to myself, that a core belief kind of lives within us almost at an unconscious level, and it has to be attacked pretty rigorously. Like we have to catch it, like in the moment where I was trying to be perfect. If I say, wow, what was that all about? Why did I say it that way? Why did I say that? Well, I said that because I didn't want to look poorly. I didn't want to be embarrassed. Now I'm catching it. So here's a core belief. Now I identified it. Now I'm like, okay, that's not what I want. What else could I have done differently? And that's the unpacking of it that requires effort and assistance. And whether you're working with a coach, if you don't have one, work with an accountability partner, someone that you can share that insight with. Maybe it's somebody that deeply cares about you, isn't going to be critical, that you can be vulnerable with. But unless you're identifying when those things pop up, you're not going to be able to catch when that schema is taking over your behavior and thereby taking you down the wrong path. But you can catch it. And when you start to catch it, and the key word is notice, notice, notice. When you notice it, then you can begin to adjust it. But without noticing it, you'll just keep doing the same thing.
Well, Don, thank you for your
welcome.
partnership. Thank you for your leadership and your impact. I want to thank all of you for joining this week's episode of the Unconventional Leadership Podcast. Don and I and our team are here for you. If this discussion prompted an idea, a thought, a concern, a perspective that you're like, wow, I never thought about that. I'd love to have someone further to talk about it. We're here for you. We look forward to the next discussion. We want to thank the Cincinnati Podcast Studio for all that they do to produce such a great experience for our listeners and for taking the pressure off of us so we can just have a great dialogue. So we'll see you in the next episode.